I started out on this fabric covering adventure using the lower door half to learn on, and that was a good thing to start with because it was relatively small and it had straight edges on it, so it was easy to get started with as far as covering. I worked out kind of most of the bugs on that, or some of the bugs on that. Then I went to the horizontal stabilizers, which were bigger, and they're a little more complicated in that they have to have rib stitching on them for the ribs, and they also have a curve on the leading edge spar, but it's not an aggressive curve, though it was easy. Not too bad to do. It was a good way to start figuring out how to do curves and stuff. And I could do that with one piece by folding it over the trailing edge spar and then gluing it up on the leading edge spar and making the curve up there. And we progressed on to the elevators, and we've got one elevator there in the back that I'm doing now, working on now. And they were quite a bit more complicated. You need to glue two pieces together on that, and also there's a curve, continuous curve all the way around it as well as the balance on the front there for the air balance. Anyway, it was quite a bit more complicated, but it's still fairly straightforward. So now we come to the rudder, and looking at it, it looks like the rudder is pretty much the same as the elevators, and it is. The shape is pretty close to the same as the elevator, and it's got similar curves on it. It does have a little bit more radical curve down here on this lower section than the elevators do, but it's got a few more things thrown in there to complicate it. One is we've got the rudder horn here, which is up on this spar, this forward spar, and inside the envelope of the fabric, where the ones on the elevators are outside of the envelope of the fabric, so you don't have to deal with them. This one will have to deal with not only cutting it out to fitting it around there and then making a gusset for it and stuff. So that adds a little bit of complication to that. I've also got another horn that goes in there through this tube for the tail wheel steering. In this case, it'll be the water rudder steering, and that'll have to go up through the tube there and be drilled out and bolted on, but that can be done after the fabric is on later on. Then throwing another little complication in there is the aft position light, or the tail light. We've got to work around it, and then up here on the top post of the rudder, we've also got the beacon. Now, the original rudder that came on the airplane when I bought it had a cage welded on to the rudder for the beacon, but that rudder was rotted out down here. This lower section was rotted out the first time we worked on the controls 10 years ago, and when we recovered and repaired the elevators and horizontal stabilizer, we had to replace the rudder, and we got a new rudder, and that one come just like this one, nothing on there for the beacon. And we got this adapter. This is an F. Atlee Dodge adapter, and fiberglass, and it goes on here on top of this main post for the beacon to go on to, and that's got to be underneath the fabric too, so that's just one more thing. I suppose a person could put that on after you put the fabric in, but putting it on beforehand and covering over it makes it a little more finished. So anyway, that adds another complication to it. So this is the adapter from F. Atlee Dodge, and there's an STC for that. We had to get that to put on there. Anyway, I've got it all cleaned up, the fabric, the dope and everything off of it, and the paint cleaned off of it. And the guy that I had do that before didn't do any finish work on this. He just took it off, so there's some raw edges here on the fiberglass and sharp raw edges. I got those trimmed up a little bit. So this can go on right here, and it can go on either with a cherry rivet or a screw. So, and that's got to be figured out in the covering. And the other thing I have to do on this before I cover it is I've got to wire it for the tail light and the beacon. I've got to run the wires through here and stuff. And we'll also have to have an exit point where the wire comes out to hook into the airframe. This one mounts vertically. There's no, well, the up and down, up is here and down is at the other end. So there's no side there that's going to be lower out of sight to figure out which side to put the seam on. Ordinarily, in most of the airplanes and stuff, you come into them on the Cessnas, you come into them on the left side generally. On the Piper here, on the Cub, the operating side is from the right side. So if I put that first layer of fabric here on the left side and make my seam on the left side, then that's the side that's more out of sight. So the first thing I have to do on this, of course, is I'll mount this position light bracket and get the wiring. I have to get my wiring out and run the wires for those things. Got the rudder ready to cover now. I've got the wiring hooked up into it, and that's what needed to be done. I had holes drilled into these ribs that I drilled in there before I painted the rudder, as I wanted to make sure that those holes got covered with paint, that there was no raw metal in there, and those holes for protection for corrosion resistance. I found some 1/4 inch grommets and put in each one of those holes, and then I got dug out the wire. This is the same wire that comes down the fuselage from the fuse panel for the beacon and the nav light, and it's a 2-wire cable with the ground. It's a shielded cable. The shielding is the ground. I put a cable clamp in here, a small cable clamp I put in for a strain relief on that where it comes out, so when this invariably is going to get pulled on a little bit, so that should stop it from pulling all the way through. And then a strain relief there, run through the grommet, and then I stripped the cable back in here and pulled the shielding off from the 2 carrier wires. And I got the wires for the nav light and the beacon. These are single wire shielded wires, and so I'm using the shielding for ground on those, on both of them. And I stripped the shielding off from it, exposed the shielding from the wire, and I spliced those all in together, the 3 shields from the main cable coming up and each one going up to the beacon and the nav light, put them on a ring shank connector, and I drilled a hole in this rib and I put that ring shank connector in there. I cleaned the paint and everything away from the contact on that, so it has a nice good chassis ground into this. It's kind of hurt to scrape all the paint off of that, but the electronics technician in me knows you've got to have a good paint all off of there to make sure and get a good ground. So that's what I did. I used a stainless steel screw in there to screw that down, and then to stop any corrosion, to protect that bare metal, I covered everything up with some RTV, some clear RTV, and I squirted enough around there it'll be some strain relief on that wiring and stuff where it goes through there too. Well, here going through both the beacon and the nav light, I used a little bit of heat shrink tubing and took some 25,000 safety wire and run through the heat shrink tubing and then shrunk it down around the wire so that'll pull through, and I can run that safety wire up through this tail position light mount, and I cover over that, and when I get done I can just pull that and pull that wire through there. Did the same thing on the up top end there with the beacon. I run my cable out. I've got a pretty good length cable running out here that'll go into the airframe to connect into that, then it'll go out the left side, and I run a piece of heat shrink tubing over that all the way up in, right up close to that cable clamp, and that'll act as an abrasion resistance and protection for that wire. But it also, this is heavy heat shrink tubing, heavy wall heat shrink tubing, and it's adhesive lined, so the adhesive comes out on there and seals in there, makes a good watertight seal, so that'll protect it from any water creeping up in between the heat shrink and the wire wrap. Well, I cleaned up my beacon mount up there and mounted it up with a couple of Cherry Max rivets, flathead Cherry Max rivets. So all that's ready to go now. It's ready to cover. Yeah, I've got the other elevator ready. The cover's on both sides now. I've cleaned up the leading edge already. Heat shrunk it down and everything where it's glued together the seams. Need to clean up the trailing edge, and then I can heat shrink the fabric, poly brush it, and start poking holes in it to do the rib lacing on it. Now here's the difference between the rudder and the elevator. See the rudder here, the balance, the aerodynamic balance portion of it is a little bit larger than on the elevator, and the rudder is not quite as tall or as long, depending on which one you're looking at, and it's a little bit deeper. Elevator number 2 is coming along nicely. I got the rib stitching in, and I've got the finishing tapes on the ribs. I put the seaplane drain grommets on the trailing edge, and I've got the first piece of finishing tape going across the main spar there. And I thought I'd get my rudder out and work on it a little bit. There's not a whole lot of information on the Cub and the Cub type airplanes as far as working on them goes. Piper published a parts manual for it, and that's pretty good. It's got some okay drawings and stuff in it. You can work through that quite a bit and see some of the things. Most of the parts are in there are listed. A lot of the hardware is not listed in there in the parts manual. A lot of the nuts and bolts and things like that. So that's kind of guessing by gosh. There is no maintenance manual or assembly manual or anything like that for a Cub. There is an L21 assembly manual, and that is still kind of lacking in information. It has some more in it, or some in it that you can use, but it's missing a lot. I happened to come across some, I think they're converted from blueprints, but some drawings for the parts for the Cub, and I've been going through those. Now those have the information that you would get off of a blueprint, the type of material, the sizes, the dimensions, kind of a different views of it, things like that. It's got like the cables we need, the rudder cables and things like that. And I got a lot of wing parts on there. I did find one on the rudder and one on the elevator and stuff, a finished assembly on the rudder and elevator. And it shows different ones. There's a breakdown of it, like the tail post and the rudder post, and it's got the rudder horn in there and how to make it and what type of material it is and the shape and all of that kind of stuff. But it also shows a finished assembly with the cover on and without the cover on. Now not all of them had lights on it, and some of them did have the light here, position light in the tail, and they showed the wire for that. And they showed it being just take some friction tape and wrap around this lower rib to hold it on, and then wrap it around here around the tail post or the main spar there to hold it on there, and then run it out through here. It didn't have a wire going up for the rotating beacon, because of course in those days the rotating beacons, when they were used, were great big heavy things that you wouldn't want to mount on your movable rudder. They were generally put on the fuselage someplace. So anyway, they didn't have that on there, so they didn't really show out this wire going up here. Now the original airplanes, they used a lot of friction tape in places, and I noticed that when I tore the old airframe apart, that there was friction tape used on some of the things like the fuel lines and stuff like that in places for anti-chafe and to hold them down. And that's what it said in that book, or in that drawing, was to use friction tape to hold this wire down to this lower rib. So it's somewhat traditional. So anyway, in the spirit of tradition, I went ahead and taped this wire up for the aft position light, taped it down to this lower rib. Now I'm not sure how we're going to go about stitching this. One of the things I did find interesting in there is it showed it covered, all the different controls covered, and I put stitching in the elevators every 2 inches and in horizontal stabilizers also, so that puts a lot of stitches in there. And looking at the drawings, they only had limited stitching on there. Like on the short rib there near the outside of it, they'd have 1 stitch there, and then 2 on that one, 3 on that one, and then 2 on the inboard one. So we've got plenty of stitching on here. So I'll lay this out. I'll have kind of some odd stitching on this lower rib, but we'll get it figured out. I got my second elevator here. It's almost done. Just getting ready to set up to put the last piece of finishing tape on there around the trailing edge. And a little bit of cleanup work, and I'll hang it up and put it out of the way until we make the paint booth. Get the rudder back there, and I've got my first piece of fabric on the left side of it. Of course glued down around the main post, and I glued it up to the trailing edge and around the perimeter there. I've just got to finish that up and out a little bit now, trim it up and finish gluing it around the inside. These are the drawings that I found for the rudder, and this is for the rudder assembly covered, and it just shows the covering on it, the fabric. And they use 2 pieces of fabric on this for each side. They use 1 piece of fabric at this lower section of the rudder up to this top rib, and then a second piece here on the top rib. This is the right side, this is the left side. They're both the same, except they've got the wire for the tail position light coming out on the left side, which is fine, that's where we want it. You can see they use a lot less rib stitching. Here the first rib stitch on these lower rib is 7 inches from the main post there, the main spar, for these first 2 ribs, and 5.5 inches for the second one. And they're 14 inches apart between the 2 of them on the lower one, and 11 inches here. Of course they've got to change the distance for this top one just because of the symmetry of the rudder there. And they have 1 rib stitch up here on this top rib, but then of course there's a seam here and seam tape there. And they just use 2.5 inch pink tape for reinforcing tape all the way around, and a couple of little fabric circles underneath or over the top of the rib stitch in there. There is a fabric reinforcement, and they do have a layout plan for the fabric reinforcement over the rudder horn. And then they have a grommet down here at the absolute bottom, and that's on both sides of the rudder. Here on the left side they show the wire, and they've got a distance here measured coming out above the rudder horn, but there's no distance in there. They just show a mark showing there's a certain gap there, but there's no definite distance shown. They've got the wire coming in, and they've got a grommet, actually used a washer there, and then a fabric boot over that. And then the wire comes in and is taped with friction tape to the post, and then runs down this rib. And they've got it running underneath the rib up in the channel and taped on with a couple spots of friction tape. And then they must have a hole here where they run the wire out and up to the tail position light. And of course we're going to do that a little bit different, where I've got the hole here and run the wire here, and then a second wire up here. But anyway, it's interesting to see how they've done it here, and you can use the manufacturer's suggestion for this. So I've got way more rib stitching than what I need on here. I'm going to have to adjust my rib stitching over here to account for the wiring. There's kind of a bundle right there that I've got to go around. So the first rib stitch can be 2 inches, and that'll go through that loop down there where the wire comes off from that cable clamp before it goes through that grommet. I can fit a stitch through there, and then I have to go back past where my ground cable is tied into the rudder on there. So I'll try to keep that symmetrical on all of those, figure that out.